Hello and welcome to another episode of pianoTV. I am Allysia, your host, and today I wanted to reapproach a topic that we addressed way back in the day when this channel was first in its infancy. And that question is, how long does it really take to learn piano? Now, I stand by what I said in that original video, but I did want to do a different take on it today and maybe even expand on it a little bit. So the very short answer to that question, how long does it take to learn piano, is a long time. I have read a book, I read it quite a few years ago actually, called The Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell. And in this book, he talks about the 10,000 hours of practice theory. And this is like a pretty popular theory that gets passed around. So I wanted to approach learning piano in the context of 10,000 hours. So let's dive in. Okay, so let's talk about the theory first. The theory from Malcolm Gladwell's book, The Outliers, goes that to become an expert on anything, you need to put in approximately 10,000 hours of practice. That could be everything from piano to painting to engineering to whatever the topic is. Some popular examples he uses to illustrate this point include Bill Gates, who in the 70s spent like pretty much all of his free time in the computer lab back when computers were still in their infancy. He also illustrates the Beatles. And the Beatles had a unique situation when they were first getting started in that they had a daily show that they played in Hamburg like every single night, and it was like 4 or 5 hours. And since they did this like every single day for I believe a couple years, they really got to like hone their craftsmanship, their performing skills, their improvisational skills. It's thought that before they even achieved success, like in general, they'd already played well over 1,000 shows. And as you do the math, it doesn't quite get them to 10,000 hours, but if you go all the way back from when they first joined and started their band, they would have easily had 10,000 hours of performance practice before they became popular in America. Okay, so we're gonna get a little bit mathy here. How long does that actually translate into like real life? How many hours does it take a day, say, to get to the 10,000 hour mark? If you play piano for 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, so 40-hour work weeks, but, you know, playing piano, how long do you think it would take you to get to 10,000 hours? It would take nearly 5 years of that to hit this like ultimate mastery stage, which is like 5 years doesn't sound too bad, but most of us can't devote full-time hours to playing piano. It's just not realistic. So let's look at a more realistic amount then. An hour a day is something that a lot of people aspire to. Still a little unrealistic for some people. If you were to do an hour a day, 365 days of the year, it would take you 27 years to hit this like mastery level. And that's where we start getting into like, oh my God, like that's 3 decades. That is a long time. And that's every single day. I mean, there's bound to be days you don't practice, right? And think about people who were practicing for only 30 minutes a day, 365 days of the year. Then we're looking at 54 years to achieve this like pinnacle of mastery. So what does this mean for people who start piano later in life and who don't have the capacity to devote full-time hours to do it? So is this actually just a really depressing video and all hope is lost, so we should just pack it up and I don't know, not practice anymore? That's obviously, well, I hope it's obvious that that's not what I'm getting at. Now, in this theory, it takes 10,000 hours to reach a level of being an expert, but expert is the key word. You'll become like adequate and very good and quite skilled well before you hit this like so-called expert pinnacle. Everyone's idea of competency is a little bit different, and your idea of what being competent at piano means is going to be different than maybe my idea, the next person's idea. But in general, what I see in my studio is for the standard adult beginner, it usually takes about 2 years until they get to a point where they're like feeling pretty comfortable with reading music. They're not like playing big crazy pieces yet, but by the 2-year mark, they usually at least have 1 or 2 big pieces under their belt. Something that's a little bit more complex, maybe like an intermediate stretch goal piece that they've been working on for several months. So 2 years to me, and this is like half an hour to an hour a day of practice. So you can do the math on that. For a couple of years, that's well under 1,000 hours of practice to just like basic competency. So again, at 2 years, most adults are able to play something simple with chords, like a pop song with chords. They're usually able to understand that. Maybe like an easier intermediate piece, a stretch piece like Comptine d'Altre Et, things by Jan Tiersen, that kind of thing. And maybe even some entry-level Bach and Chopin. Now, Chopin's easiest piece is at about a grade 6 level, but the reason I like to introduce Chopin maybe a little early is because a lot of people really like him, and they'll practice a Chopin piece. They're motivated to it. Now, once we get beyond like basic competency, which I find occurs around the 2-year mark, you'll find the vast majority of really interesting piano music is at like a grade 9 level or higher. So like an early advanced level and beyond. And I find most people, it takes like a minimum of 5 years to get to this point. 5 years of consistent practice, which is still pegging you probably between like 1,000 and 3,000 hours of practice. Now, I did some math of practice in my own life and how much I think I've practiced, and I encourage you to do the same. So for those of you who have been playing piano for a while, sit down for 15 minutes and try to work out how many hours that you actually practiced. And if you do that, let me know. I would be really interested to know how many hours it took you to feel like reasonably competent versus like feeling like you're pretty good, and so on. But using myself as an example here, this has been kind of complicated for me to calculate because I've done 2 types of piano playing in my life. So one is like solo piano, whether it be classical or pop, and the other is playing keyboard in a band, which is totally different. Like it isn't as technical. So I tried to split them as best as I could, and I'm not including like all of my piano performance, like keyboard, like rock band keyboard performance stuff in with my solo piano stuff. I'm just keeping it separate. Now, the other thing that complicates my calculations here is that I have been like a very inconsistent practicer throughout life. There's been periods of high motivation, maybe I'm working for exams, doing competitions, just really feeling it, where I practice a lot. And then there's been periods where I practice very, very little. And I'm actually in one of those periods right now because I'm having a hard time balancing having a baby and being able to spend time on the piano as well as doing the million other things I need to do. So I find my practices looked like this throughout my life. Okay, so we're going to start with the assumption that my practice would have averaged to about 30 minutes a day between the ages of 7 and 12, 5 days a week. This is probably very generous. And that would put me at 650 hours by the age of 12. Okay. And then around the teenager stage, I started getting a little bit more serious. So let's bump it up to 1 hour a day, 5 days a week, between 13 and 16 years old. And that's going to give me another 1,000 hours. Around 16, I dropped out of piano lessons. I joined a band. I started getting really into songwriting. So let's just say that between the ages of 16 and 20, I didn't even practice at all. That's not true, but like for the sake of simplicity, it's a total wash. There was no practice there. And then at around age 20, I started getting back into exam mode. And this is where I would start oscillating between like 2 and 3 hours a day of practice to absolutely nothing. So let's just say for the last, between age 20 and 31, I've been doing an hour a day for like a decade. So that's about 3,000 hours. And then that takes us to age 31. I had a baby that's recent. And though I've probably clocked like a handful of hours since then, again, we're just going to call it moot. We're going to say that's like the stopping point of this experiment. So I'm not even halfway to the 10,000 hour mark. And to be perfectly honest, these numbers feel a little bit inflated to me. I think that the reality would be a little lower. But the reason that I felt comfortable with these estimations is because I have played so much keyboard like in a different context. So I'm averaging out to a little bit below 5,000 hours. But what I want to do with this now is figure out what my basic level of competencies were. So what I mean by that is, okay, so at age 12, after about 650 hours, I was pretty competent. So I was able to play competitions and do quite well in them. I often won competitions in my age group. And then, for example, at age 14, one piece that I remember working on was Marching Season by Yanni. And that's like a pretty like late intermediate level piece. So being able to play something like that at approximately 1,000 hours seems like a realistic estimation. I did my grade 8 exam probably around age 20. And about that point, it would have been about 1,500 hours to hit that point. So you could say to get to a grade 8 point in piano would be approximately 1,500 hours. And grade 8 is like late intermediate, early advanced. And then I did my grade 9 exam in 2014. I did my grade 10 exam in 2015. I did them like pretty close back to back. Now I did quite well on my grade exam. I got a mark in the high 80s, but I did pretty bad on my grade 10 exam. I've talked about that on this channel. My mark was in the high 60s for that one. So for grade 9, I'd clocked about 3,500 hours. You notice it's a huge jump from the grade 8 exam. That was because there was such a large gap between when I took them, but also because I feel like there's actually a huge jump in difficulty when you're getting from like the late intermediate stuff into some of like the really bigger, like the way bigger, meatier pieces. So by grade 10, I had probably clocked about 4,000 hours. Maybe a little higher since I really grinded for that one. So if my estimations are even remotely close to being accurate or universal, then I doubled my practice hours between grade 8 and grade 9. And again, if I wanted to get a better mark for my grade 10, it probably would have made sense to have had approximately 5,000 hours of practice under my belt. But remember that grade 10, for most people, is like a pretty high level. Like at grade 10, you're able to play some of Liszt's entry level stuff, like you can play his consolations and his Liebestrom. At grade 10, you're able to do like most of Chopin's repertoire, except for some of the harder stuff like the ballads and etudes and whatever. Again, this isn't, I don't think this will be true for everyone, but I hope that this is giving you like a helpful framework for your own goals, because it can be really hard to say like, how long is it going to take me to be able to learn such and such piece? Hopefully this is giving you something a little bit more concrete to think about. Okay, so some final thoughts on timeline. A grade 8 playing level is where I like to see most of my students hit by the end of high school. That's for like the casual students. For students who are more serious and driven, we try to get to about a grade 10 point by the end of high school. Now, grade 8 is really competent. I feel like a student who has their grade 8 is going to have music with them for the rest of their life. They're not going to forget how to play piano at that point. I see a lot of students dropping out in like the earlier grades, like grade 3, 4, 5. Those are the ones who come back, 10, 20 years later as an adult and saying like, I used to sort of play piano, but like I totally forget how to now. But once you get to grade 8, I feel like it's just always with you. You've learned how to ride that musical bike and you're never going to forget. Usually people who get to this level also don't usually stop playing piano for any extended amount of time, maybe like a year or two. But these in general aren't the students who are coming back saying, oh, I wish I remembered how to play piano. So that's why grade 8 to me is kind of like a benchmark for piano skill. So again, using myself as an example, it took me about 1,500 hours to get to that grade 8 level. 1,500 hours is totally reasonable. Let me just do some quick math in my brain here. So if you're practicing for half an hour a day, that works out to about 8 years of practice. 8 years of half an hour a day is incredibly reasonable to become quite good at the piano, because half an hour is such a small amount of time, and 8 years seems like a long time maybe now, but it passes so fast. The time's gonna pass anyway. Might as well play piano. I'm preaching to the choir, I know. Anyway, I highly enjoy the book The Outliers. I actually like Malcolm Gladwell in general. I listen to a lot of his books in audio format. They're full of like good anecdotes and they're pretty motivational. So check out The Outliers if you want to know more about this and some of the other interesting topics addressed in that book. 10,000 hours is a huge amount of time, I know, but there is a big difference, as hopefully we've talked about enough, between mastery and competency. And you're going to hit competency well before you hit mastery. And the time's going to pass anyway. So maybe you'll get to 10,000 hours in your lifetime. Maybe you won't, but you'll be able to play piano well far before that point. Hopefully this was just an interesting mental framework for you. I thought it was interesting for me to go in and actually like think about how much I've practiced throughout my life, and it really gives me perspective. It makes me want to practice more. So maybe I'll get on that. With having a baby, I'll try to like figure a way to fit in some more piano practice. But without further ado, thank you so much for watching today's video. You can give it a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. Subscribe if you haven't already. And you can come hang out over on Patreon, Instagram, and etc. And I'll catch you in the next video. Bill Gates is a good example. In the 70s, he would spend hours and hours and hours upon